Hi, I'm Paolo Nespoli, Italian astronaut of the European Space Agency, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about my spaceflight experience. I flew in space in 2007 the first time as part of the crew of Space Shuttle STS-120. This was a 15 days mission, short duration mission, to build the International Space Station. And then I flew again in space in 2010 and 11 on a 6 months long increment of the space station, increment 26 and 27. And of course this was a completely different experience. The spacecraft used to go to the space station was this time a Russian Soyuz spacecraft, and we were in space for 159 days in total. You know, we call them 6 months increment. This was a little bit shorter than 6 months. So my first flight on the space shuttle was really interesting. It was, it took me quite a long time to get there, and it was the culmination of a dream. It was though a really hard work. I mean, when you are assigned to a fly on a space shuttle, it's not that you are a passenger on a spacecraft and you sit in the back reading a book. You know, you are actually flying the vehicle. There are so many activities that are done there that need to be done. In fact, the days you are in space are so precious, the time in space is so precious that the planners on the ground are really planning minute by minute, and it's a very tight choreography so that everybody needs to really work together so things can be done in tight order. Specifically, our task on that mission was to deliver on the space station one of the new modules. It was the Node 2, a module that would have allowed the expansion of the space station and the attachment of the Japanese and European laboratory. So we carried this module on the cargo bay of the shuttle, and we needed to simply take it out with the robotic arm, hook it up to station, and then send out 2 people on spacewalks to hook up cables and things like this. And then the second main task of the flight, main operational task of the flight, was a very complex relocation of a group of solar arrays that initially had been put on top of the station because the station was still built, and so they put on top this solar array, deploy them so that they could get power. But then they mounted the external truss of the station, which is a truss that brought the solar array further out so they can turn around and spin following the sun. And now we had this initial one sitting here, so we needed to fold it up. Actually, it was already folded when we got up on station. But grab it with the robotic arm, send out somebody on a spacewalk, remove all the bolts, the cabling, the connection from the space station, so this could be handed over to the station arm, brought all the way at the end of the truss, reconnected again, out on a spacewalk, rebolt everything, and open up the solar array. This was a very tight, complex operation. Required high choreography between the spacewalks, the arm, also because once you disconnect all the cables, the battery inside will die if they are not thermally controlled after a few hours. So I think we had like some 11 or 12 hours of time frame in which the cable could be disconnected, but then they really need to be connected again, otherwise the whole thing would be dying and probably get destroyed and not usable anymore. We took off from Cape Kennedy. I had several years of training, basic training, advanced training. I did a lot of simulation with everybody, and you get used in the simulations to really pay attention to what's going on, read the instruments. A lot of people ask me, wow, how did it feel the first launch? And I was tell people, I don't know. I was looking at the instruments. I was trying to figure out, my part. I was ready. I was primed to jump in case of emergency, as we did many times in simulations, and nothing happened. I mean, we just took off and flew in space in this 8.5 minutes of ride, of this really ride that pushes you in space, and nothing happened. Everything was according to plan. So I kind of enjoyed it. I kind of felt like, wow, this is really interesting. The space shuttle is a very powerful machine. So you're sitting on or laying on this chair on the launch pad, and when the engine lights up, it's like you get a train that gets you on the back and slams you in space and keeps pushing even more. So where you're like actually down in the chair, push down to a velocity, final velocity, you have to go to Mach 25 actually. You start of course Mach 0, Mach 25, 28,000 kilometers per hour, and the acceleration you are subjected is limited by the shuttle system to Mach 3. So you get to space, and during the simulation, you have done dozens, if not hundreds of simulations. When you get to space and you are alive, this is the end of it. You may start another simulation, you do 2 or 3 or 4, and then you go home and carry on with your life. But there, 8.5 minutes, you are in space, and now you start working. Now you feel and experience this microgravity, but you have a job to do. I remember I had my first job was to reconfigure the communication system of the shuttle so we could talk to ground. Until I did not reconfigure that, we could not talk to ground. So the ground would see telemetry, but we could not able to talk to us. So it took me a few minutes to reconfigure, and then almost trembly, I called Houston Discovery Comcheck. And I was with great relief that I heard Houston back, Discovery Houston, we're here loud and clear, welcome to space. And that was really nice feeling. But still, we had a lot of work to do. So the shuttle mission was really work. Everything was going fairly well. When eventually, at a certain point, I heard through the comm that we were having a major malfunction. And that was a surprise to me. You don't want to hear when you're in space, Houston, we have a problem. And you think like, it's a joke or something, but it was no joke. So during one of these very tightly complex operation, the solar array, we managed to bring it out, do all the operation as it was supposed to do, stay on time and everything. When they deployed the solar array started breaking up. There was a cut, and the cut was a major one, which could have caused serious problem both of the station and to us on the shuttle. So it was a moment almost similar to Apollo 13. What can we do here in space? How can we fix this? So the ground told us that they were thinking about it, we were thinking about in space, and then eventually we had several calls with the ground, conference call, discussions. We knew that they were working really hard. They were trying to figure out what we had on board, what we could use, and eventually they came up with a plan that we thought was crazy, kind of incredible. But eventually we discussed it, we looked at it, we discussed it between us, and we figured out that time was going. We could not stay in space really long, so we had to take charge and really execute this very daring spacewalk. When we sent 2 astronauts out, and we sent one of them very close to the solar array, and essentially put some stitches through the part that was cut, so that if we continue the deployment, the cut would not continue. That was really challenging, because the location of where there was this broken part was essentially not accessible to a spacewalk. So we had to put the spacewalker, which in this case was American astronaut Scott Parazynski, we had to put it on top of the robotic arm and kind of bring it there, but the robotic arm was not long enough. So we had to use another piece that was not really meant for doing that, and then an extension, and then something more. So it was really, really a daring part. Scott executed a 7-hour spacewalk with the help of Doug Wheelock, and with the help of us that inside the spacecraft really made sure that they were doing exactly the procedure as they had sent us from the ground to space. And so eventually we fixed the whole thing. They came back. We were really, really happy. The solar array was deployed all the way to the end, and that's it. I mean, we carried out also some experiments. I had on board some experiments from the Italian Space Agency, some from the European Space Agency. There were some other activities we did. We actually managed to do everything. We get an extension on our time in space. Originally, it was not supposed to be 15 days, but with the problems and everything, we ended up flying total time 15 days, 2 hours and some minutes, which is almost one of the longest. It's not the longest, but for the space shuttle, a kind of a long mission, because you have now 7 people in a very confined environment, and the resources of the shuttle, the oxygen, the water, the toilet, the food, can only support 7 people for a limited amount of time. So we came back to Cape Kennedy, and we were really proud of what we had accomplished. In fact, as a matter of fact, when we flew back to Houston the day after, the President of the United States arrived with Air Force One, greeted us and congratulated us for what we did, and then he left, and we kept going with our life. So it was really interesting.